Hello, everyone. Welcome to Diplomatic Briefing. After Trump returned to power, American-style bullying was no longer concealed. The U.S. withdrew from multiple international organizations, not only cutting aid to developing countries, but also accusing the United Nations of frequently siding with China. The truth is, China strongly supports resolving international affairs through the United Nations. The United States believes this would weaken its own influence. Recently, China's diplomatic team has changed its previous style. Instead of just passively responding to statements made by US representatives, they have started to take the initiative. On the morning of August 26th, the second regular session of 2025 for the executive boards of the United Nations Development Programme, the United Nations Population Fund, and the United Nations Office for Project Services continued for its fourth day. China's Deputy Permanent Representative to the United Nations,孙磊, said in his speech that, as expected, the U.S. representative will soon repeat the same old accusations in their remarks, groundlessly criticizing the legitimate cooperation between China and the Population Fund. These accusations are completely unfounded. China firmly rejects them. China's individual proposals fully comply with the rules of the Executive Board and align with the overall direction of the United Nations Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework with China.孙磊emphasized that China does not envy the development of other countries, nor does it unreasonably suppress or contain them, not even sparing its own neighbors, allies, or the least developed countries. Who was it that cut off funding to the Population Fund, putting millions of women and children in distress at risk of survival? Who is it that has abandoned the international consensus on development? The international community sees all of this very clearly.孙磊said that if the U.S. representative does not criticize China in his speech, it means he has truly repented, and China acknowledges this. Admitting one's mistakes is a good thing. If the U.S. representative remains obstinate and criticizes China again, China has already made its position clear. As expected by the Chinese side, the U.S. representative continued to launch unreasonable attacks and smear China in his subsequent remarks, declaring that they do not support allocating resources to China.孙Lei's speech resonated on mainland internet and also drew the attention of diplomatic observers. There are a few key points to summarize. First, the best defense is a good offense. Ambassador Sun's speech was a textbook example of tactical rhetoric. He preemptively stated what the U.S. representative would say, rendering the U.S.'s sophistry weak and indefensible. Second, when it was the U.S. representative's turn to speak, they faced a dilemma. They couldn't avoid criticizing China, as the main purpose of the U.S. representative at these debates is to seize the opportunity to criticize China. Ultimately, they still had to level accusations against China. I'm sure that after hearing this, representatives from other countries must have felt that once again China had hit the nail on the head. When your opponent announces what you are planning to do before you can, it's hard not to feel embarrassed. But when you're following Trump's team, saving face is the least of your concerns. Third, by using this tactic, the Chinese representative showed no regard for saving face for the US, as if to mockingly say, "I've already seen through your tricks, and I'm letting the whole world know in advance." This kind of approach, showing no diplomatic courtesy at all, is something China has rarely used in the past. As the US becomes increasingly blatant in its bullying, China grows stronger in the face of adversity, overwhelming the US both in momentum and strength, because Trump only bullies the weak and fears the strong. Just look at Europe's experience. Concessions only lead to humiliation. On August 26, Politico published an article lamenting that, in the face of Trump, Europe is finally experiencing the humiliation China suffered during the Opium Wars. In August 1842, a group of Qing dynasty officials boarded the British warship HMS Cornwallis, anchored on the Yangtze River near Nanjing, to sign the Treaty of Nanking, the first unequal treaty in modern Chinese history. In July 2025, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen hurried to President Trump's Gulf resort in Turnberry, Scotland, to finalize a trade agreement that European officials have denounced as unfair. Although nearly 2 centuries apart, and despite the different settings and parties involved, these two meetings share striking similarities. The article laments that, in a strikingly similar turn of events, the EU is now forced to swallow the bitter fruit of a trade deal imposed by Trump, finally experiencing firsthand the humiliation China suffered during the Opium Wars, and this may only be the beginning of a new century of humiliation for Europe. The article quotes politicians and analysts expressing concern that the EU has already lost the influence it once believed it possessed. Von der Leyen's compromise has come under fire. Critics bluntly state that accepting Trump's demand to impose a 15% tariff on most European goods is tantamount to surrender. It is a clear political failure for the EU, and even more so, an ideological and moral capitulation. If von der Leyen hopes that such concessions will stop Trump from pressing further, then a harsh reality inevitably awaits her. No sooner had the ink dried on the agreement than Trump escalated further, launching an attack on EU digital services on August 25th. According to insiders, dissatisfied with the EU's Digital Services Act for scrutinizing American speech and believing it places a heavy burden on US tech companies, the Trump administration is now considering imposing sanctions on European officials responsible for enforcing this law. Trump himself warned that if the EU does not eliminate its discriminatory practices, the US will impose export restrictions on its core technologies and chips. Less than a week ago, the EU naively believed it had secured a written commitment from the United States, ensuring the safety of their digital regulatory system and sovereignty. But this latest statement from Trump was a rude awakening. The report points out that Trump's pressure tactics are strikingly similar to those of 19th century British imperialism. He holds two trump cards, military and technology, and he is well aware that the EU lags far behind in both areas. He knows that without US military support, Europe is unwilling to confront Russian President Putin head-on, and without American chip technology, European industries would struggle to keep running. Therefore, he is confident that he can dominate the trade agenda. Mara Šefčovič, the European Commission official responsible for trade and economic security, once stated that the new transatlantic trade agreement has exposed Europe's strategic weaknesses and its dependence on the United States. He said that this is not just about trade, but also about security, the Ukraine issue, and the current geopolitical turmoil. Benedikt Franke, director of the Global Public Policy Institute based in Berlin, further pointed out that this agreement stems directly from Europe's weakness in the field of security. Europe is unable to guarantee its own military security, and for the past 20 years has consistently failed to invest sufficient resources in the security sector. Franke also stated that Europe is lacking in both investment in technological capabilities and in deepening the single market. According to Politico, the current European Union is now paying the price for lagging behind the United States by several decades. After the end of the Cold War, Europe drastically reduced its defense spending, which led to a long-term reliance on American military power for security. Its complacency toward technological development has also caused the EU to fall behind global competitors in nearly all key technological fields. In addition, Europe has ignored various warning signs for many years. On the 25th, Sabine Weyand, Director General for Trade at the European Commission, said during a panel discussion at the Altbach European Forum, "We are now paying the price for the choices we made in the past. During Trump's first term, we were given a warning, but then we went back to being blind to the risks. I hope that this time we won't repeat the same mistakes." However, Trump's unpredictable tariff games are clearly far from over. As both sides attempt to finalize the various outstanding details, the article suggests that this alliance of 27 countries is bound to face further humiliation this autumn. Pia Pujada, a researcher at the Bruegel Institute, said that the wording of the US-EU trade agreement is extremely vague, making it easy for conflicts to escalate on many issues, which could then be used as an excuse to justify not fulfilling other commitments in the future. Earlier this month, Trump stated that if the EU fails to fulfill its commitment to invest $600 billion in the United States, a 35% tariff would be imposed on it. Although the EU is well aware of the risks and argues that the $600 billion is merely an expression of corporate intent, which officials cannot force companies to fulfill, Trump could very well use this as a pretext to apply further pressure. As for this US-EU trade agreement, the EU has promoted it as a relatively less bad option under the threat of Trump's tariffs. However, Brussels' compromise actually proves that blackmail tactics are effective. According to an article by Politico, in order to prevent humiliation from becoming the norm, the EU urgently needs to significantly reduce its dependence on the US in the fields of defense, technology, and finance. This is undoubtedly a daunting task. So, in the face of ongoing bullying and pressure, how can the EU avoid remaining geopolitically weak in the long term? The article states that, in fact, before the agreement was reached, von der Leyen had proposed three major strategies for dealing with the US: preparing retaliatory measures, diversifying trade partners, and strengthening the EU single market. This approach has gained the approval of many people. Former president of the European Central Bank and former Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi once warned that, although Trump has the ability to force the EU to act according to his wishes, this fact alone proves that if the EU cannot take effective action, it will inevitably become marginalized or even face an even worse situation. France's Minister for European Affairs, Haddad, has called on the EU to emulate the United States by making large-scale investments in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and green technologies. In addition, expanding and diversifying trade partners is also seen as a key to breaking the deadlock. Bernd Lange, chair of the European Parliament's Committee on International Trade, emphasized that in addition to promoting reform of the World Trade Organization, WTO, the EU must focus on building a network of trade agreements with reliable partners, forging consensus with democratic countries, and stabilizing a rules-based trading system. However, Noah Drum, a research analyst at the German Marshall Fund, believes that Europe is facing a choice. In a world where globalization is gradually receding, should Europe consolidate its position as a center of free trade, or will it become a battleground for intensifying competition between China and the United States? Mainland Observer Network sums it up by saying that history has repeatedly proven that there is no justice under the rule of power. Only by being strong enough can one truly control their own destiny. Whether Europe can break free from its current humiliating predicament not only concerns its own future, but will also profoundly influence the direction of global order. After reading this Western analytical article, first of all, it addresses reality. Europe is indeed being humiliated. Second, however, many of the solutions proposed by experts and scholars in the article still cling to rhetoric such as strengthening alliances with democratic countries, which shows that the EU remains trapped in ideology and has not truly recognized its own situation